Welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure to, as I said, welcome you to the Waterloo Arts Distinguished Lecture Series in Economics. This lecture is part of many initiatives undertaken by the Faculty of Arts to improve the experience of our students and to share with the community at large exciting and interesting research that happens in the fields of economics. Of these initiatives, this one, the Distinguished Lecture in Economics, is one of my favorite. And it is not just because I am an economist myself, it is mostly because I am painfully aware of how difficult it is sometimes for economists, maybe more so than for other social scientists, to communicate the results of our work here at the university. I always remember how when I was a young PhD student visiting home and was talking to my grandma, and there were these two questions that she always posed to me that were horrible to wait for. One was, of course, when will you have kids? And there was not much I could do about that. But the other one was also very dreary. She looked at me and said, but what is this that you do? And I could never give her an answer that made her happy or that had any meaning for her. So economists actually use powerful tools to analyze data, to try to understand the mechanisms that underlie economic behavior, and we have a unique perspective to offer. So whether we are talking about the future of jobs, as we will be doing here, or the race of inequality, the determinants of economic behavior, or whether some particular policy is good or bad, our contribution is really, I think, really important. So we live in a world that is growing increasingly complex, that is saturated with information, and not all of that information is actually trustworthy. So we actually owe it to ourselves to try and find out and seek the answers to these questions. So the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Waterloo is proud to contribute to this communication of research and to remain a reliable source of information that informs public debate. The Distinguished Lecture Series in Economics brings you ideas like top of the class or top of the world ideas that economists are developed trying to answer these questions. And for the past 5 years, we actually have introduced you to first-rate speakers that have truly revolutionized their field of expertise and had a profound impact in society. So our sixth speaker in the series is actually one of the best ones yet. So I will leave my colleague, Stephanie Lewis, to introduce our distinguished speaker now, and then we'll proceed with the talk, and we will have some question and answers later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I will stick to my notes, otherwise I'll spend more than 3 minutes and you probably don't want to hear me talk, given who is coming next. So it is with great pleasure that, and with no hesitation, that I recommend Professor David Card for the University of Waterloo Arts Distinguished Lecture this year. David is the class of 1950 professor of economics at Berkeley, where he's been working for 20 years. And before that, he was working for 15 years at Princeton. Princeton is also where he received his PhD in the field of labor economics. What may or may not be as well known is that David grew up close to here, near in the Guelph area, where his mother lives. And by the way, I've heard that rumors earlier that her mother is hosting a party tonight, so at her farm, so stick until the reception and you might get the address. So David has an impressive collection of publications in the most prestigious journals in economics. And for that reason, he's among the most famous labor economists known to any economist, all of them. If you take a graduate course in labor economics, at least half of the reading list will be papers by David. Name any topic, minimum wage, education, immigration, strikes, wage differentials, technological advances, any topic I dare and there won't be none that hasn't have a paper written by David on that topic, and probably more than one paper, actually. I guess the most impressive is not so much that he's very prolific, but it's also that many of his papers have had and brought key results and really made us think about the problem differently. Sometimes controversial results, coming from using different data, coming from using different experiments, emphasizing the role of new complexities that we hadn't thought about before. So another area where David is very prolific is in mentoring graduate students. He has produced, I think, more than 1,000 of successful labor economists that are now all over the world. In fact, one of them is my supervisor, Thomas Lemieux. And that would make David my academic grandfather. My apologies, David, if that makes you sound old. That's the price to pay to be so efficient in producing graduate students. I bet there are many academic grandchildren all over Canada that are yours. So I think I'm not the only one looking forward to hearing David's thoughts and findings on the impact of firms and jobs in the labor market. And our students nowadays, I think, are not really worried about whether they're going to find a job. I think their worry is about whether they'll find a good job. So we're looking forward to hearing about that today. And so please join me in welcoming David here tonight.
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, it's a great honor to be here. I grew up near here, north of Guelph, but I've never actually been on the campus before for more than just a stroll through the grounds, so it's very nice to visit, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to give a lecture about a topic that reflects some of the work I've been doing over the last 10 years on trying to understand the way the labor market works. And one of the things that came out as I was working away on this the last couple of days was how it may not seem very surprising to most non-economists, most of the things I'm going to talk about. So this is an example of economists rediscovering in some ways what many people already knew. So the way I'm going to start this is by trying to explain as best as I can what economists used to think about the labor market and how that thinking has been evolving in the last 20 years as new data has become available that help us to understand better the way the labor market actually works. So most of us think in terms of jobs when we're thinking about the labor market. And in particular, as Stephanie said, many people are concerned about not so much whether they're going to have a job, but whether they're going to have a good job, a job that is meaningful in their careers, that pays well, that leads to some opportunities and so on. But in standard economic modeling, surprisingly enough, this isn't really a well-defined concept. In fact, in the kind of models that economists widely use to study the world, and this is probably a reflection of the sad state of economics more than anything else, there aren't really good and bad jobs. There are only more and less productive workers. And so when economists come to look at questions like minimum wages or immigration or training policies or decisions about whether a local government should try and subsidize an employer to come into town, they're kind of stuck with a framework where it doesn't really make 100% sense to talk about good jobs. And over the last 20 years or so, that view has gradually evolved into a different view about the way the labor market actually works. And I'm going to call that, for purposes of today's talk, I'm going to call that a job ladder model. And I'm going to discuss how that view of the labor market works and how it helps us to understand the way that the labor market responds to forces behind the scenes that are very important for people's lives and for outcomes. So just briefly, what does a job ladder mean? Well, job ladder means exactly what you would think it would mean. I grew up in this area in the late 60s and early 70s, and everyone knew that there were certain employers that were more attractive places to work and other employers that were less attractive places to work. And if you were really lucky, you might eventually find your way to one of those better jobs. And some people somehow got stuck at a lower level, and others managed to get to a better employer eventually. So the idea of a job ladder is that different employers occupy rungs on the ladder, and wages and other benefits of the job would typically rise as you move up the job ladder. So if you move from, I like to give the example because in Northern California it's extremely clear. If you move from Berkeley, where I teach, to Stanford, the kind of private institution a few miles down the road, typically you would see wages would go up by 15 or 20%. Pension would be better, the healthcare program would be better, and so on. So we would think about Stanford as occupying a slightly higher job ladder than Berkeley. And many of you can think of situations in your own life that would be similar to that, where there would be pretty well-defined order. Now, I don't know my firms in the Kitchener-Waterloo area as well as I used to, but when I was a kid, everybody who was sort of graduating early out of high school on the kind of dropout program would have wanted to get a job at Budd Automotive. That was sort of the classic. And the idea of a job ladder is that the status of these jobs is fairly similar for different workers. So if you're a less skilled worker, you would still like to go to the firm higher up the job ladder. And if you're a highly skilled worker, you'd also like to do that. So all of us would more or less rank most of these jobs the same. And the way I've described that verbally is that the job ladder is similar for those of us in different positions in the labor market. And I guess this is true in this area as well as in my area. We all want to work for Google. So everybody knows that that's going to be a good employer. There's a lot of opportunities there. That's going to go places. Now, the other thing that's true about a job ladder model, and this is going to come up in a lot of the applications that I'm going to discuss, is that at the higher rungs of the ladder, so if you're thinking about going to Google, it's not that easy to get to Google. It's a little bit easier to start at a lower level employer and try to work your way up. And there's a lot of career counseling and parental advice and so on of exactly how to do that. Do you get a co-op program, for example, and try and get a foot in the door when you're going through college, and then use that as a basis to try and get further up the ladder? And those kind of features are extremely widely, it turns out, this kind of feature of the job market is extremely widely spread. So it isn't just Canada, it isn't just Southern Ontario. It turns out that this aspect of the job market seems to be pretty much universal in Western societies. And so what is the implications of that? Well, as I'm going to talk about, what seems to be going on in many countries, including the US, now this is one area, unfortunately, where what we know about Canada is a little limited. And the reason why is because in order to study the job ladder, you need to have extremely detailed data where you can follow individuals as they move between jobs. And you need to be able to assign each person to their coworkers. So I need to be able to say, okay, all these people work at this firm, these people work at that firm, these guys just moved to that job, what happened to their wages? And that kind of data is not yet available in Canada, although in the next few years, my understanding is it will become available. So anyway, what seems to be happening is two things. First of all, the rungs of the ladder are pulling apart. So the differences between the better firms and the lower firms on the rank have widened. And what that means is it becomes more and more important to get a good job. And I think all of us intuitively understand that. And if you have, if you're a younger person just starting out in the law market, or if you've got kids or family members in that category, you're very much aware of this. There's a very strong concern that a job is not a job. There are different rungs, and we need to try and find a way to get to a better rung. So that structure helps to explain a lot of puzzles, this job ladder structure. It helps to explain both rising wage inequality and also a lot of features that go on in the labor market that are changing or adapting over time. For example, I'm going to show later on a discussion about the gender wage gap in a couple of countries, where you can see very clearly that the jobs available to women and men are slightly different. And one of the disadvantages that females have is it becomes harder and harder for them to march up the job ladder relative to men. And so those very best jobs are often somewhat limited. Another feature that you can easily understand in this framework, and I'm going to talk about, is the so-called return to education. In other words, what's the economic benefit of a higher degree? Well, one of the big benefits is the type of firms you can get access to. And I think everyone who's here probably is very much aware of that one of the big benefits, for example, of going to University of Waterloo with a very strong co-op program, strong connections to the tech community, is the access to a certain set of jobs. Some other things that I'm going to talk about are related, but a little bit more subtle. For example, I'm going to show or discuss how to interpret some of the lasting effects of the business cycle. So when the economy goes south for a few years, as it did back in the 2008-2009 era, that has a persistent effect on generations of students. And why is that? Generations of workers as well. Well, for two reasons. One, the type of jobs that turn out to be opening up at different points in the business cycle are at different points in the job ladder. And so understanding how that's working over time is very helpful in understanding why people are having trouble, why jobs seem to be worse and better, and so on. And it's related to another thing that I'll talk about, which is the extreme cost of job displacement. Why is it that a worker in their 40s who loses a job may well never see the same kind of earnings that they had on their last job for the rest of their career? And many people, I think, who are in the age range that I'm more in, are very much aware of this, aware of the fact that there's a certain precariousness associated with your position because your position on the job ladder could evaporate, and those rungs are far apart. So that's the kind of structure that I'm going to talk about. Before I get there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to step back and help understand a little bit what is the perspective of the textbook model of the labor market. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I've actually been teaching for almost 35 years. I've taught this model many times. I've used it in many of my research papers, and this is a starting point, but it has a lot of weaknesses. So the textbook model has one defining characteristic that most people, when they finally understand this, are tempted to throw the book in the trash. And that is the so-called law of one price. Now, the law of one price says that at any point in time in any market, there's one price for any given thing. And I give the example here, just like prices are the same at all gas stations. So the law of one price says that those 4 gas stations that you crossed on the way here this afternoon all charge the same price for gas. And of course, we know that isn't true. So the law of one price is not actually true in most markets. It might be true in the stock market. So this afternoon at 3 p.m. when the TSE closed, all the shares were valued the same. That's the law of one price in action. But for many, many realistic commodities, the law of one price is not true. And one of the problems for analyzing economic phenomena, complex economic phenomena like the labor market, is this departure. How do we think about that? How do we incorporate that in our thinking? But I would say that it's important to understand if you're a consumer of economics rather than a producer, one of the most important things to understand is that 95% of economic prescriptions are based on these kind of stories where the law of one price is holding. So when someone says that if you raise the minimum wage, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, they're starting from a point of view where any given worker gets the same wage no matter what employer they work at. And if someone forces all their employers to raise their wage, that's going to be difficult because there isn't much margin of substitution there. Another example is understanding immigration policy. When someone says immigrants come to the country and lower wages, they're thinking about a world where all wages are the same for any given worker and where the only way that an employer can be induced to hire an extra worker is to lower their wage. So that's the kind of starting point for standard economics. It's also the starting point, and this is a little less obvious if you're not an economist, it's also a starting point for thinking about the way economists think about things like discrimination policies. So the way that economists think about discrimination really comes about from a 1950s study by one of the most important people in my field, who was a graduate student at Princeton in the 1950s and was studying black and white wages. And at that time, the most important phenomenon to understand about discrimination was many, many employers didn't hire African-American workers, and most of the employers that did only hired African-American workers. So the world at that time was totally segregated. And the standard economic model of discrimination is a model like that, where the wage that you pay as an employer is the same because the law of one price is in effect. And your only decision is, do I hire women or do I hire men? Do I hire African Americans or people of different ethnic origin, or do I hire the same old white guys I always hired? Okay. So one of the problems with that class of models, and we're going to talk about this, is that it's descriptively unrealistic. And descriptively unrealistic in two important ways I'm going to emphasize here. One is that there's no special link between who you work for and who you are. So it really, in that sort of world, and this is the standard way that economists think about the labor market and most other markets, it doesn't really matter who you work for. And if you think about it, when you first meet someone socially, the third question, Anglo-Saxons, of course, being very forward, will ask this right away: who do you work for? Because what you're really doing is you're trying to assess their caste. We're trying to figure out, like, where do you fit in the job ladder? And so the way we do that is we ask who you work for. And that defines you in a very important way, and yet it's descriptively missing from this class of models. So that's already an indication there's something wrong. Moreover, as we'll talk about statistically, if one was to evaluate data, one would find that who you work for matters a lot. A second aspect of this that's kind of funny if you live in this area where the tech industry and lots of other industries as well, is that in this setting, one good firm in the local labor market is enough. That its benefits spill over to everybody. Why is that? Well, because if a firm out there is willing to pay a lot for a certain kind of services, so someone who's a good Python programmer can get a good job at Google, then everybody else has to match Google's wages right away. Okay? Now, we all know that isn't descriptively true as well. And that gives rise to an understanding of the way the labor market works that isn't necessarily that helpful when it comes to discussions about employment situations. So I want to sort of let you think about that class of models as we go forward and say that's kind of the background that was confronting the field of labor economics in the early 1990s. When a number of us first got interested in trying to think about alternative ways of looking at the situation. And the evolution of thought in this area is something like the following. So this sort of view of the labor market working like any other market and markets as a whole working very efficiently reached its zenith in Western thought in the 1920s, so just before the Great Depression, ironically. And so there's a lot of the legacy that we still teach in textbooks today, in Economics 101 or 102, or even up to the 300 level in most cases, would be ideas that were really well developed, made into a mathematical modeling and discussed and widely assimilated starting in the 1920s. There were, in many countries, including Canada and the United States, there were groups of economists and others, sociologists and people that were specialists in the labor market in particular, who were somewhat, we would call them dissenters. These were people who thought, there's something missing here. I don't quite believe that everything works this well. I don't quite think that this is descriptively realistic. And that view was sort of carried through all through the 1940s and 1950s. And when I first came to Princeton in 1978 as a graduate student, Princeton had been one of the places where that view had been sort of held on, probably the longest, partially because of historical accident and partially because of just certain personalities, as often happens in academia. But that view was widely thought to be essentially irrelevant. It was thought to, that sort of idea that we had to focus on the effects of things like minimum wages and unions and how firms actually set wages was considered to be kind of an antique view. And part of the reason for that, ironically, is not necessarily an intellectual reason. It's because in the 1960s, economics first became a data-intensive subject. And the first data sets that were widely available to economists to study things like the labor market were data sets collected from the census. So if you've ever been involved with the census, you know, for example, in the Canadian census, if you get the long form, you fill out a form and you give your education, your age. You might give the degree, your highest degree, what field it was in. You give a little bit of information about your employer. You don't give the name of your employer. You might say, I work for the public sector, the non-public sector, that kind of thing. So that kind of data became available, first computerized data sets in the early 1960s. Around the time, I guess, that the computer science department at this university was revolutionizing with a new kind of Fortran that I actually learned in high school called What4, Waterloo Fortran. I don't know, does anybody, am I the only person who ever heard of that? Probably. It was superseded, of course, by What5, which was version 5. You know, as computer scientists are good at coming up with incredibly insightful labels. So anyway, around the time of What4 and What5, these data sets become available, and people started studying the labor market and analyzing things like the fact that people with higher education earn more. And they were able, everyone kind of understood that that was true, but it became sort of a thing that one could document, study the evolution of the differences between different education groups. And one of the problems with this data was it didn't tell you who worked for whom. It wasn't very useful to ask who worked for whom because most of the computers at that time could only handle a sample of 10,000 or 20,000 observations, kind of thing that you can do in an Excel spreadsheet nowadays. But at that time, 10 or 20,000 observations was a massive data set. And so instead of having 100% of everybody in the Canadian population filling out information, we had a tiny, tiny sample. 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 people would fill out these forms, and we would be able to analyze that data. And when we did that, there wasn't any information about employers, and so we kind of said to ourselves, how do we understand that? Well, we went back to the 1920s models, and in those models, there are no employers. Employers are irrelevant because the law of one price says that any given person's wages are determined in the market. And so all you need to know about a person is what market they're in. And so that sort of thinking became extremely widespread in economics, and it's actually a very helpful perspective. It leads to a lot of simplification, and it allowed, I think, my field to really become quite influential in economics by being able to simplify and discuss important phenomenon from the point of view of ignoring firms. In the 1970s, things started to change. First of all, some of the data sets collected for the first time, this was revolutionary data. They collected information on, was the employer that you worked for a unionized employer or not? And so this was really the very first job ladder model. This was a model with 2 rungs. Either you worked at a regular job or you had a union job. And of course, those of us who grew up in Southern Ontario, we knew that you wanted to get the union job. That was going to pay an advantage. It was probably going to have better benefits. But we didn't really think about it as like multiple steps of the ladder. We thought about it as this set of jobs and that set of jobs. At the same time, researchers, mostly sociologists, a few economists, went out and started to collect information on individual workers as they grew older over time. So they started to collect an annual survey or survey every couple of years of the same folks. And when they did that, they realized it was useful to ask each person, are you still working today for the employer you worked for last time we surveyed you, or are you on a new job? And collecting that information in the 1970s for the first time, which was done by the panel study of income dynamics in Michigan, it became immediately clear that when people change jobs, things happen. Their wages changed, their hours of work changed. So it became sort of obvious to the researchers at that time that the particular job an individual held was quite important. But the researchers didn't really have a strong way to think about that. And the way that evolved was to think about, and this is actually still the way that most economists think about the labor market, partially because most economists are very individual-oriented, you might say. And so they're going to think about this as everybody has their own job ladder. So I, as an individual, am going to go out and look for jobs, and I might be lucky and find a better job, and then after a while I might find a better job after that, and then I might get unlucky and get fired from that job and go back down, so like a game of snakes and ladders. But there isn't really a commonality in that class of models. There's only an individual model. And ironically, this is the model that economists use for the marriage market. So I'm out there looking for a partner. I find one partner. I might find another partner. You can see why economists are very popular at cocktail parties. I get rid of the one partner, get the new partner, then the other partner gets rid of me, and then I'm back down. So they think about that in idiosyncratic ladder model. Okay. Now, in the context of that class of models, what has emerged starting in the 1970s, but more in the 1980s and 1990s, was some persistent puzzles. And these puzzles became documented as we got better and better data. So one of the lessons from, I hope you can take away from my talk, is that economics is kind of a moving subject, and especially labor economics. The reason why we move most often is not because we've got any brilliant intellectual insights, necessarily. It's because somebody gave us new data and we realized what we used to think is screwed up. So we started to collect information that allowed us to follow not just a small sample, 100 or 200 or 2,000 people over time, but large numbers of people. And one of the important results came about in the early 1990s when two of my PhD students at that time from Princeton, who subsequently went on to become quite well-known researchers, documented something that I think many people intuitively understood, but wasn't really previously on the record, and that was they studied a lot of workers who lost their jobs from large manufacturing firms that went out of business in the 1982 recession in Pittsburgh area of Pennsylvania. And what they showed was that most of those workers 10 years later were still doing terribly, even the younger ones. So losing a job, even as a 25 or 30-year-old from one of those plants was an extremely serious economic cost, and large and persistent wage losses coming about from those kind of displacements. And that pattern has been documented in many different countries, including Canada. So if someone is working at a GM plant in Oshawa and that plant closes down, you can be fairly certain that there's going to be a period of adjustment, and even when it's over, a certain fraction of the people who lost that job will not be able to return to as good a job. Okay, so that was one of the problems. And that's kind of inconsistent with the law of one price. Because if everybody was paid what they were worth and what the market would reward them one day, the next day when the plant closes down, shouldn't they just be able to go out and grab another job? And that, you can see what the problem is. A second thing that has become documented is that if you look not so much at the worker side, but at the firm side or at the plant level side, so looking at individual workplaces, there's enormous differences in productivity. And this perspective was actually first developed in agricultural economics, which is an important subfield of economics, not as important as it used to be. And in that field, it was noted that there would be multiple farmers in an area. And if you drive north of here, go towards Elmira or something, you can see this on the road. You can see one farm that looks extremely productive. Everything seems to be very modern. The people who live there seem to be doing well. And you can see right side by side another farm that's not doing so well. Looks like they're just kind of struggling to get by. And that phenomenon is actually extremely pervasive. So if you were to go out and interview small manufacturing firms in this area, you would find a very diverse experience. And if you measured their productivity of workers at those firms, you would see, typically you'd see a range of productivity that's around 100%. That's not off the charts. So in other words, there would be two plants working in a similar area, say injection molding, an older one and a newer one, and there might be as much as 100% differential in the productivity. So the law of one price is not holding in this productivity dimension as well. A third puzzle, there's many, many more of these puzzles, but I'm going to highlight a couple because some of these have connections to Canada. A third puzzle that was pretty interesting, one of my PhD students who now teaches at the University of Toronto, named Phil Oreopoulos, developed a study in which he looked at Canadian graduates of Canadian universities as they entered the labor market, and he was able to use tax data and look at people who are graduating in 1974, 1975, 1976, 77, 78, and so on. And what he found was that graduates of a given program, for example, economics at Queen's University, which I graduated from, the students who graduated from that program would face substantially different conditions in their first few years on the job, depending on whether it was a good year or a bad year. And most interestingly, those differences would persist over at least the first 15 years of their careers. So people would actually, you would say, well, why did you even look for a job? You should have actually just taken 3 years off, gone to the Caribbean, and come back. And that was more or less what Phil's results suggested, that we actually like hurting yourself looking for a job in a recession. So if things turn bad and, you know, mom says you can come back home, I think it might be a good idea, according to this result. But again, the question emerges, what's going on? Why is this happening? And the resolution, I think, has been this development of a concept of these job ladder models. So the idea is that an employer has, in a job ladder model, an employer has a sort of a wage policy. And the policy essentially, in the simplest versions of these stories, amounts to paying a percentage differential above or below the typical going wage in the market. So in my example of Berkeley and Stanford, Stanford sort of has a policy of paying 10 or 15% more than Berkeley. And the interesting thing is that's not just true for the faculty, it's true for the janitors, it's true for the secretaries. I had an extremely efficient office person in my research operation, and unfortunately, she was lured away by Stanford, so that's why I keep bringing this up. So that's the first assumption. In that class of models, what happens in that world, what happens is what really matters at a point in time is not just who you are, but who you happen to be working for. And that's the content. That's a very simple idea. It's a very straightforward point, but it means that your position in the labor market reflects not just all the skills you bring to the labor market, not just the stuff that labor economists call your human capital, but also this other thing, which is where are you on the job ladder? Are you currently at a good job? Are you currently at not as good a job? And that is an important, simple point that is easy to omit, I guess, if you're kind of working with pencil and paper. It's a lot harder to ignore if you're actually entering the job market. So I think most people will find this completely intuitive and reasonable. Now, this idea had been out there for a while, and about 10 or 12 years ago, a colleague and I were trying to think about this model. And we were trying to think about how we actually assess whether this is correct or not. So is it really true that individuals find themselves in positions on the job ladder, A? And B, is it really true that the job ladder is more or less the same for different people? And we came up with an idea about how to evaluate that. And this turns out to be fairly insightful, so I'm going to put you through a little exercise here, and I hope you don't mind looking at a graph. This is data from West Germany. You might say, why do I know about West Germany? Well, I don't know that much. I've spent a lot of time in Nuremberg, which is where the statistical office is. But it turns out West Germany was one of the countries which was leading in making available data for researchers to study individuals working, every individual in the country and all the jobs that they had at every point in time and following them over time and so on. So we used this data, and we decided we would try and do a simple exercise where we look at job changers. So here's going to be a series of graphs which follow the wage histories. So these are the daily wages of people, actually males in Germany. The data for women look fairly similar. As they change jobs, and I'm going to make a really simple observation. I'm going to ask, what's the average pay of your coworkers on your current job? Okay? And this is like a labor market IQ test. Would you rather move to a job where everyone else's wage is high, or would you rather move to a job where everyone else's wage is low? Okay, now everybody knows that they'd rather move, I hope at least, that they'd rather, otherwise you fail this test. You'd rather move, or everyone who sort of ever had a real job, I think, would know that you want to move to a place where other people are well paid. There's something about that that's just intuitively obvious. So here's the graph. So just to set the stage, this is real data. It doesn't look that real, but it's real. So there's an average daily wage in a log scale. These are full-time. These are very good, stolid German citizens working on lots of good German jobs. This is data from the 2000s era. And I'm following them for 4 years. 2 years before on their old job and 2 years after on the new job. And what I'm doing is I'm ranking their jobs by the average pay of their coworkers. Okay? So I'm going to put your coworkers into 4 buckets, quartiles. That's the jargon for buckets, ranked buckets. So the first quartile is the lowest, 4th quartile is the highest. These are guys that are working in the lowest quartile of firms at the first 2 years, -2 and -1. At the gray line, they change jobs. Next year, they're working at a new job, but they haven't moved up or down the job ladder in this definition. Their coworkers are still in the bottom bucket. Okay? So their average wage is fairly stable. And you can see that if you were to change jobs but not change your coworkers, it doesn't really do you much good. Now I'm going to show you what happens if you change jobs and move up the ladder to the 2nd quartile or to the 3rd quartile or to the 4th quartile. And this is the data. And you can see that there's a pretty strong advantage. For example, the gray lines with the yellow diamonds represent kind of the winners in this particular job market. They're individuals who the first 2 years were working with a bunch of first quartile workers, co-workers, and later on, by some miracle, kind of win the lottery and go to the 4th quartile, and their wages are going to rise by 40 points, 40 log points, 40 percentage points. So this is an enormous wage increase. Okay, this is kind of like I used to be working at Starbucks and I got a job at Google. Okay, it's not that good, but it's pretty good. And you can see that if you only go up 1 step on the ladder, from 1 to 2, your daily wage is going to rise maybe 10 or 15 percentage points. If you go up to the 3rd step, it's going to rise more. If you go to the 4th step, it's going to rise more. Now, there's a few interesting features of this graph that I'm going to force you to think about. This is my teaching moment here. One thing you can see is that beforehand, they were a little different. The ones who moved up the ladder were already earning more. The ones who stayed at the bottom of the ladder were earning less. And that is a very important phenomenon that emerges in all of these data, which is, on average, the people who are more highly skilled, who would earn more at any given job, tend to move up the ladder. And on average, people who are at the bottom in terms of their own personal skills tend to have less opportunities to move up and tend to be more likely, if they move, to move across or even down. And that's a pattern that I'm going to call assortativeness. That's a very unfortunate economics word that I can just barely pronounce. It means the sorting of people is highly correlated with the type of employer that they have. So people who have, on average, a set of skills that would be rewarded highly no matter where they worked are more likely to move up. Those who have a set of skills that are less likely to be rewarded highly and more likely to be rewarded in a lower level are more likely to stay constant or move down. So this is the pattern you see for people who move up. What about people who move down? Well, it looks like this. So unfortunately, for the people in the blue line, you can see they were calmly going away at a nice firm with highly paid workers. Something happened to that firm, in most of these cases, downsized or even went out of business. And they were forced to move, and the best opportunity that came along for them was a first quartile opportunity. So these guys they took about a 35% wage cut. And that's the kind of wage cuts you see in these data for lots and lots and lots of movers. On the other hand, there were a bunch of people who moved only down 1 step or down 2 steps, same kind of pattern, but not as severe. And one of the things that's interesting here, again, you see those who are at the bottom in terms of they're all at 4th quartile firms, but the ones at the bottom of the pay scale, the blue line, they're more likely to move down, okay? The ones who are at the top are more likely to move across. And there's a kind of an interesting picture. This is a picture of all the changes. So there's people who can stay in the 4th quartile, people who can stay in a 3rd quartile, people who can stay in a 2nd, or people who can stay in a 1st. They're along the diagonal of this graph. Over here on the left are the people who started at a 1, the blue square that looks like a Manhattan skyscraper. They started at a 1 and went to a 4. And down here, the subterranean skyscraper, are people who started at a 4 and moved to a 1. Okay, does everybody understand the graph? Now you can see, if you look at this graph, an interesting pattern, which is the steps going up the job ladder are about the same as the steps going down. This is actually a very important lesson. It doesn't seem that surprising, I think, if you're not an economist. Many things are surprising to economists that shouldn't be that surprising to anyone else. The reason that this is important is it says that this job ladder phenomenon is sort of symmetric. You can go up the ladder, you can go down the ladder equally. And so what turns out to be true is that this pattern of changes is extremely pervasive. So in my own research, I've looked at similar kinds of data for Italy, Portugal, and Brazil. In other people's research, they've looked at Belgium, France, Sweden, and Norway. You see there's no Canada here. There is one recent study that looks at United States. So that's the closest to home that you're going to find. And all of them show this same pattern. So all of these labor markets, although if you think about the difference between a labor market in Germany and one in Brazil is quite substantial. Brazil is a much lower income country. Nevertheless, these patterns persist. There's 6 main points that have emerged in this empirical study of how the job ladder works in different contexts. One is that wages systematically rise or fall based on coworker pay. So we can see that pretty clearly. The steps can be wide. Another lesson from this analysis is that just changing jobs itself doesn't necessarily give you much. If you change jobs and your coworkers are on average paid about the same, you're going to be on average paid about the same. So just getting a new boss, that might make the job more enjoyable, but it isn't going to raise your pay. I guess we all know that. The steps up and down are approximately symmetric. And then the last 2 points are the points about who moves up and who moves down. So the people who tend to move up tend to have earned more beforehand. The people who tend to move down tend to earn less. What that means is the job ladder is gradually magnifying inequality. So if you take a bunch of people coming out of college and they all start jobs, and you look at where they are in the job ladder, so in the German context, some of them would be starting at a very high-paying firm like Siemens or Daimler, and some of them would be starting at a very low-paying firm like the local manufacturer, Hans's stamping plant. And those groups of workers, over time, the one set who started on average at the high-paying firms are going to move up. The ones who started at the low-paying firms are going to move down. And that means by the time they get to be in their 50s and 60s, the gaps between these workers are enormous. And that corresponds, I think, to what most people think as their own experience, which is many of the people that you knew or followed, or you can see big gaps emerging as time goes on. And it seems like some combination of luck and circumstance and possibly just the way the labor market has evolved. Okay, so with that context, let me talk about a couple of quick applications. So wage inequality. Well, this job ladder position turns out to be very important. It explains about 20% of the overall variation in wages. And that's true in every country that we've been able to study so far. So if I know your employer, I get 20% of explained for free just by knowing who that is. That's not huge, but it's important. The second thing that's true in all countries is that on average, the higher skilled workers, those who would earn more, tend to be sorted further up the ladder. And that means the job ladder magnifies inequality, as I mentioned before. So on average, the people who are in the United States, especially with college graduates, I like to say, like the very best of you are going to go work at Goldman Sachs, okay? Which is, of course, one of the highest paying finance jobs in the country, i.e. one of the most highly paid jobs in the country. And that's just going to magnify everything, because now not only are they highly skilled, but they're also working for employers that pay a lot. And that phenomenon seems to have widened quite a bit in the last 30 years. And so in a study I did in Germany, the one that sort of I've been talking about, we first documented that the phenomenon of differentiating across different employers has been growing over time. And so these not only have the gaps between the rungs of the ladder widened, but also the probability that someone in different skill groups is sorted into different categories of jobs has changed quite substantially. This is a simple graph showing the evolution of characteristics of your coworkers. So the red line shows the average education of your coworkers and how that's related to you at a plant-by-plant level in this German data. And it shows that between 1985 and 2009, the average connection between your education and your coworkers has risen. So you're more and more likely to be working with people who are, if you're low educated, are poorly educated, or if you're high educated, are highly educated. So these workplaces are pulling apart. The same thing is true if we were to measure in terms of occupations, which is the blue line in that graph. As a result of that, if we were to decompose this is the rise in wage inequality in Germany. which looks similar in magnitude to the rise in wage inequality in Canada and the United States. It happens at a later time. It happens in the 1990s in Germany rather than the 1980s in North America. You would see that a good chunk of the rise is that red line, that red part of that graph, which is the part contributing, associated with the fact that highly skilled workers are more and more likely to get good jobs. Okay? And again, this is intuitively, I think, quite reasonable. Everyone has a feeling like the set of jobs that are available may be changing a little bit, but what's more and more important is it's more and more difficult to get those jobs unless you're at the very top, unless you're really competitive. So the chance of getting one of those jobs seems to be more and more elusive for people who aren't at the very top of the skill distribution. So that component is quite large. The job ladder component is the blue, that's large. The green, which isn't explained because of my mistake I made last night at midnight when I was putting the slide together, that is the part that's due to your own personal skills, and that's also growing over time. So it's the case that all three of these components are contributing importantly to the rise in inequality, but the most remarkable is probably the red part, which is something that really wasn't even you could understand in the absence of one of these job ladder models. This rising assortiveness is troubling, and I think you could think about some of the political issues that we're facing as a country here in Canada or in the United States, where just 10 times worse down there, have to do with the probability that these better jobs are sort of rationed and no longer available to people in the middle and lower tail of the distribution. And people are feeling more and more disconnected from those opportunities. And a recent study, another study that, not one that I did, but some colleagues did of Germany, followed in particular sets of workers, cafeteria workers, cleaning and logistics workers who were outsourced. So in other words, they were working at a pretty high-paying firm. That firm decided to just close down its own cafeteria and outsource the workers. And following those guys, you could show very clearly that they were sustaining very large losses. And one of the questions that this research sort of calls up is there a growing incentive for some firms to, instead of offering all their workers a pay premium, to narrowly target that premium just to the executives or just to upper management? And I call that the Walmart model, where the executives at Walmart are extremely well paid, but the day-to-day workers are at the bottom of the job ladder market. And that's a different pattern of the job market than has persisted in most of the rest of the world up to this point. A second application is to race and gender. I mentioned this. You could ask two key questions once you've got this job ladder model in your mind. First of all, are women more or less likely to move up the job ladder? And secondly, are the steps, the rungs of the job ladder, are they as far apart for women, or are they narrowed? And in a study I did with a couple of colleagues looking at data for Portugal, we found that actually both of those things are true. So women are less likely to work at high-paying jobs, and the female job ladder is a little more compressed, and together those two phenomena explain about a quarter of the male-female wage gap across the board. Portugal is an interesting country. Although it's a relatively poor European country, it has high labor force participation, so women there actually work more than Canadian women, and they're not like taking time off and leaving the labor market and stuff like that. So their job ladder is in many ways a more interesting, easy to understand benchmark. In a study I've been working on in Brazil, I've used the same kind of framework to try and understand the differences between non-white and white workers, and again find the same pattern. So the job ladder seems to be more restrictive, and it seems to be that maybe the rungs of the ladder are a little different for different groups, and that helps us understand these very pervasive patterns. Another pattern that's important to understand if you're thinking about sending your kids to college or graduating from college, getting a master's degree, is that going to pay off? And one of the things that is pervasive in all the Western economies is that the apparent returns to higher education have risen very sharply. Why is that? Well, in data from Germany and Portugal, been able to show that most of the rise in the return to education is actually very intimately connected with the job ladder. So it seems to be the case that these jobs further up the job ladder are more and more associated with people who've got highest levels of education, and that that pattern plus the widening of the gap between the rungs has really contributed to the rise in educational differences. let me just, since I'm kind of running out of time, I'm just going to move on to another application. I mentioned this before, so Oreopoulos, Van Wachter, and Heitz studied the university grads. They showed these large persistent effects. And in subsequent work, what they showed was that what seems to be going on is that in a really bad year, so when the recession is really strongest, parts of the job market close down. And importantly, the hiring of these high-rung firms seems to almost stop. So there are jobs available when there's a recession, but most of those jobs are very far down the job ladder. And I think that corresponds to common wisdom. If you've lived through a recession, I was unfortunate enough to graduate from 1978, which was, up till that time, was one of the worst recessions. Now we look back and say, well, that was just a picnic. But there's pretty clear evidence that the job market changes over time, and the set of firms that are hiring can change. And as a result of that, some workers become locked in to positions in the job market, which will then carry them for the next 10 years. So there's a kind of a cost of entering a job market when there aren't many opportunities at the high job ladder firms, because those opportunities are often targeted at fresh graduates. And if you've been out for 4 or 5 years, you might not be able to get back in the same place. And so that's going to kind of carry through one's career. The same kind of pattern seems to persist in the job market more generally. So in a recession, what we see is the set of opportunities for moving up the job ladder stop, and people tend to move down the job ladder. In an expansion, when things are going well, as they are right now, for example, in most parts of North America, there's more opportunities to move up the job ladder. And so the typical wage growth that we expect to see at the top of the business cycle is in large part accommodated by changes in opportunities and openings at different points in the job ladder. So let me just move on to my last application. So a phenomenon that's extremely interesting to think about, especially, this is probably even more important from my perspective in south of the border than it is here. One of the things that you can see very clearly going on in the US is large pockets of the country which seem to be just incredibly economically depressed. So it's sort of the Newfoundland phenomenon from the old days. Now, Newfoundland isn't nearly as bad as it used to be, but there's like whole parts of the United States which seem to be lost. And what's going on? Well, one thing that's definitely going on in those parts of the country is that there's no upper tail firms. The job ladder kind of tops out with relatively few upper rungs. And a colleague of mine, Enrico Moretti, has been working on this very much. This is his topic of interest. And what he's discerned is that what seems to go on in different cities, especially large cities versus very small cities, is that in the larger cities, there's more of a pattern where the job market is heavily sorted. So people at the lowest skill levels are assigned to the lowest tiers of the job ladder, and people at higher skill levels are assigned, manage to get further up the job ladder. And that has two really important implications. One is that large cities are more unequal, and that's a very strong phenomenon. So if you look at wage inequality patterns, one of the most unequal places in the US is like Los Angeles. Really big city, seems to be a thriving place, but the gap between the highest and the lowest is extraordinarily wide. And in Enrico's analysis, this is driven in part by this pattern where the matching of workers to the positions on the rungs of the job ladder is more and more highly correlated in larger cities. The other thing that's true about this pattern is it means that if you're a highly skilled worker and you want to have those opportunities, you have to move to a big city, because the good opportunities at the high ends of the job ladder are in those big cities. And that's a phenomenon that's very much in evidence in many countries, not just Canada and the US, but also around Europe, for example. So the opportunities seem to be emerging more and more at the top of the job ladder in large urban labor markets, which is messing up many aspects of the economy. For example, it's really messing up the real estate markets in lots of countries, where the gap between the housing prices in thriving urban areas and less thriving smaller cities is really widening over time. And that seems to be driven by this upper tail of jobs in the top of the job ladder, which are heavily concentrated. So finally, let me talk about, for the last couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about a couple of things we don't really know much about. And this is going to perhaps come as sort of a no surprise. You know, when it comes to the fundamental things, labor economists in particular often don't know what they're talking about. We kind of know descriptively what's going on. We don't necessarily know exactly why. So what we really don't entirely understand is why firms are at different points on the job ladder. We do know there's some things in common. We do know that many of the firms at the top of the job ladder have external factors like patents, a market niche, returns to scale. So if you think about in this town, at one time, BlackBerry was probably at the top of the job ladder, and it had a market niche and patents. For a while, it had returns to scale. And so that would be an example of those kind of features, and that's very strongly related. But there's another part of the job market that seems to be, the job ladder that seems to be also important, maybe fundamentally even more important, and that is that firms at the top of the job ladder seem to be able to take a given worker and make them more productive. And why is that? Well, it seems like it has some combination of the fact that when you're at the top of the job ladder, you have less incentive to spend most of your day on Google looking for a better job. So people at the low end of the job market know exactly what I mean. There's also a stronger commitment of the employees to that job, and that's a class of models that are being developed and have been developed in the past and seem to be extremely important in understanding how I can become so much more productive that my employer can afford to pay me 40 or 50% more. That seems kind of counterintuitive why that's happening. And then there's another possibility, which is if you take a collection of good workers and put some average person in there, you might be able to make them into a good worker too. And that's, I think, in a way, the most positive view of this, that in some sense, the collections of workers at these top job ladder firms are effectively able to spill over some of their higher productivity to other workers and maybe eventually make workers more productive as a group. And a third thing I would say, some of my own research looking at these German firms in combination with some colleagues who'd done extensive surveying of job management practices showed that these higher rung firms are much better managed. If you use standard metrics of management practices like ability to control inventories and adopt modern hiring and personnel techniques and so on. Firms at the top of the job ladder do all the modern stuff that they would be taught in an MBA program. Firms at the bottom of the job ladder are kind of like, you know, old-fashioned and just kind of struggling along. So that's not too surprising, but does seem to confirm that. So what we don't know, and I'm going to leave it with this, is what can a regional or national government do to try and attract the high job ladder firms? And I think many cities and communities are thinking about this all the time. So for example, one thing we certainly can do is we can have a university. If you look across cities that have thriving universities and others, you see normally there's a stronger job market around that university and partially spilling over from the technological developments, and Waterloo would be a very good example of that. One of the things that came out of some research that I did and others was that in the period of widening inequality in Germany, why the job ladder was widening in Germany is because a set of policies were adopted which made it advantageous for low job ladder firms to expand quickly. So policies about subsidizing lower wage jobs and making firms available do have some impact on the structure. And so an open question is whether there's anything substantive that governments can do to try and change this job ladder structure, or are we just going to have to kind of sit and wait and run its course and hope for the best? And I'm going to stop there and allow people to ask questions. So the way we're going to do it is you're going to ask me a question, and then I'm going to repeat it so it's on the tape, and then I will change it so that I can answer it. Well, I'll try to answer it. And so anyway, go ahead. I'm glad to take questions. Yeah. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So typically, in terms of when they first appear with employees, so lots of startups don't have any employees. They only have like people, essentially owners, and a few people working for free. When they first appear as with employees, typically fairly high up, is what we've seen in the German context. My colleague Enrico has done more work on that too. He's very interested in that. So they're searching for fairly high-skilled workers, and they're paying, if anything, premiums relative to other firms. Yeah, so I think typically higher up the job ladder. There is some research suggesting that they do move up the job ladder as they get bigger. So I haven't really talked about that, but it seems pretty clear that firms do change their position on the job ladder as they get bigger. Yeah. So startup's still a good opportunity if you get one, yeah. Yes? Yes, I was going to mention that. He asked me what about public sector? How does the public sector fit in? So I don't know the situation in Canada as well. In the US, the public sector is extremely controversial. Americans hate the government, basically. And so they believe that the government is evil and, sucking resources and stuff. One interpretation of that is that for the type of workers it gets, the government is paying too much. That's kind of a typical American view of the public sector. Now, a problem we face in these data sets is typically the data set, for instance, in Germany and Portugal. These are data sets that are collected as part of the pension system, and the government isn't in there. They have their own pension system in those countries. So there isn't any research on this. But I think it's a fascinating question. Is there places like where the government is thought to be well run and efficient, where they fit right into the job ladder, and are there other places where they don't? I think that's an open question, but the job ladder is a good way to think about where the public sector fits. Is it a high wage firm in the job ladder, and does it get the right kind of workers considering where it is? Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
What do we know about the profitability of firms up and down the job ladder?
So he's asked me what we...
I guess what I'd be interested in knowing is whether firms deliberately hold profits down, put the money in the work into the employees, and then subsequently reap the rewards of high profitability.
Right.
10, 15 years down.
Right. So he's asking about profitability. Are firms that are further up the job ladder more profitable, less profitable? Are they dynamically investing in workers and not having as high profits? So the research that is out there that I've done and others have done suggests there's a strong positive correlation. So firms that further up the job ladder have higher productivity, higher profitability, and higher wages as well. So it's part of a package. There isn't as much detailed research on the dynamics of that. So like this would be very closely related to the startup question. So if you think about 50 startups, 47 are going to fail. One or two are going to succeed, and one is going to, sputter along. That would be kind of the typical situation. And so the question would be, like, do they have a different policy in terms of wages and profits? I don't think we know enough about that just yet. Yeah, I think that would be an awesome PhD thesis. Yeah.
In your opinion, would you rather they get the top percent of a number one ranked firm or the bottom 10% of a ranked four firm?
So he's asked me the following question. If you think about where your coworkers are paid, would you rather have highly paid coworkers holding constant your own pay, basically? That's kind of the question you're asking. I've actually worked on that. I wasn't going to talk about that, but I can. There's some evidence that people mildly prefer to be the big fish in a small pond. So the research I did was based on the fact that in 2006, all of a sudden, all the salaries at the University of California became public. So everybody could look up everyone's salaries on an internet website. And being economists, sneaky economists, we knew this was going to happen before most other people did. And so we sent surveys to people and said, have you seen this website? Which gave the salaries of all their coworkers. And then we did that randomly to some people and not to others, and we resurveyed them again, and we found the people who found out about the website from us were a little bit less happy about their job. So, you know, congratulations, we've made the world a less happy place. This is why people love economists. Yeah, so there is some evidence of that. There's competing evidence, though, that says that, for example, I would much rather work with highly paid managers. So I'd like to be the top of my coworkers. I'd like to be paid as well as all my coworkers, but I'd like to have higher paid managers. So whether that's because higher paid managers are better or because I have aspirations to become one of those people myself, no one seems to know. Yes, go ahead.
How do you think students who are entering the job market should track the economics?
Yeah.
Kind of made like an offhanded joke that if the job market's bad, you just go on vacation. But it seems like unemployment for 3 years would have more detrimental effects to your long-term career.
Yes, okay. So he's asked me if I have practical advice for students. Well, of course, the real answer is, of course, I don't have practical advice for students. If I did, I've started a startup. What seems to be true is, and this is very evident, not so much in our data, but in casual observation, is that there is some trade-off of taking a bad job. First of all, it seems like that does possibly set you up for difficulties later on in terms of explaining why you took a bad job. And secondly, it kind of ties down your interest and maybe slows down your search. But on the other hand, a gap in the resume might be considered bad. So in 2008, 2009, when the job market was extremely poor in California, and many of the really good undergraduates and graduate students from Berkeley were not easily finding jobs, lots of people were doing internships, unpaid internships. So I think there's a lot of adaptive behavior going on where people are kind of hiding or partially relabeling an experience. A lot of people go back to school. Right now, I think the job market is about as good as it's going to get. So I wouldn't, any advice I would have wouldn't pertain to this period. Yeah. But I can't really claim to give good advice. Yeah. Go ahead. So she's asked me what about the patterns in less developed countries. So as far as I've gotten on that is Brazil, which is sort of an intermediate level country. Now, one part of Brazil is actually fairly undeveloped. The northeast part of Brazil is actually quite poor. And there, it looks like we're still doing some research on that, whether the market functions in the same way. But there, in Brazil, there's a very, very high minimum wage. And so the minimum wage is kind of putting a huge post in the labor market in that context. So in a way, we can't really study it very well in that context. So I think that's an interesting question. Normally, the data for this is coming from administrative records for a pension system or unemployment insurance system, where they're collecting tax records for everybody on every job. That's how we're collecting the data. And so most less developed countries don't have a full administrative record system. They don't normally have a payroll tax or a pension system. So that's why it's going to be very difficult to study this. Yeah? Yes.
So while, like you mentioned, talking about going back to school, one of those people consistently goes back, but then also tries to have employment as he goes and don't have gaps in the resume. So like, what's the correlation between being highly skilled and not having, highly educated and not having that experience to back up that education?
Right.
To be able to apply for those jobs.
Right. So she's asked me about how do education and experience interact, particularly for highly educated people with low experience. Is there something I can say about that? Well, one thing I was going to show, but I was kind of running out of time, so I didn't show. What you can see in most countries, and especially North America, Canada and the US, the group that has the biggest benefit from labor market experience is the most highly educated. So the gain of 2 or 3 years of practical experience for someone with a master's degree is ginormous. That's a technical term. Yeah, so I don't have practical advice on how to get that, but I can tell you that it's a good idea. Yes. Yeah. Plus 5 years experience. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I think that's the plan with the Waterloo Cooperative Program. Isn't that really the whole idea of the co-op program? So I mean, I think that I would say this. I think this phenomenon of perception that access to these better jobs is becoming extremely competitive and difficult is widespread. So that's part of the story I think I'm trying to tell, which is it seems like there's this set of opportunities that are there still. If anything, they're better than ever. But it's really hard to get there. So, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Right. I see. So she's asking me about like the, yeah. Yeah. Right. So this phenomenon is especially important in Canada, more so than the US. And part of it is because the fraction of the young people with a college degree is rising very quickly here. And employers are perceiving that and notching up the requirements very quickly. So I think what will happen to someone in your generation is you're going to spend your entire life where all the old people are kind of uneducated dolts. And because the fraction of Canadians that went to university back in my cohort was quite modest. It was like less than 40%, and now it's like 60%. So there's just an enormous change in that, and that's true in Canada. It's not so true in the US, but it's true in Britain, it's true in France, and it's true like crazy in places like China. So there's a phenomenon worldwide of notching up of the education of the younger cohort. So in some sense, the expected package that you're going to bring to the job market is much higher. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, okay, so one thing I would say is I don't know for sure. If you think that assortativeness has some very strong productive value, like that classifying different, putting these workers together at different firms and different workplaces, and there's a benefit to that, like having all the highly skilled engineers in one firm and the less skilled in a second firm. If there's a benefit to that, we don't really know whether that's a good or bad thing. What I think we do know is that it's causing a perception of inequality, which is awkward, right? So if people feel like their opportunities or their children's opportunities are limited, that has a strong and profound effect on the way people feel about their country and how they participate and whether they want, to get angry and vote for some crazy party. For example, I'm not recommending that, but I'm saying that could happen. And so I feel like that it's an important phenomenon. Whether it's good or bad, I don't really know. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, one last question? Yeah, go ahead. She's asked me whether these high-rung firms are the factor driving economic growth or whether they follow economic growth. So that, of course, is one of the most difficult type of questions in all of economics, the causal ordering of events. I don't actually know. My feeling is, if you look across cities, which is a little easier to understand, you can see very clearly that like a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco, Boston has this enormous upper range of very highly paying firms, very productive firms. And other cities, modest cities, like Memphis, Tennessee, for example, that whole thing is missing. My feeling is that that has a causal effect. I don't think there's really something wrong with people in Memphis. I think that there's something, the labor market has somehow failed, but I don't exactly know why. Yeah. Okay, I think should I stop that?
Faculty of Arts at the University of Waterloo. I'd like to thank David Card for a very, very stimulating and timely talk. Those of you who've been kind of following with rapt attention the recent election of a certain government in this province will know the topicality of a lot of what's come through today. The minimum wage, there's talk about rolling it back. We've had a lot of discussion about the outputs of universities. When I was a student, we were students, then we became whether we were job ready. There's one government in this country which actually refers to being taxpayer ready. So all this is extremely timely and very, very useful for all of us. So again, thanks to David Card for providing this for us. But I'd also really like to thank the Department of Economics for taking the initiative. We've had a number of these. These are great talks of mobilizing knowledge, mobilizing discussion, taking our kind of discussions and the kind of questions we raise, bringing them to a wider audience. So kudos to the department for undertaking this. Thanks to our alumni. A number of alumni donors have helped make this realizable for us. And last of all, thanks to the audience for coming out today. Remind you there's a reception to follow. I encourage you to carry on the conversations there, and maybe we'll solve some of these questions. If not, maybe we'll just raise a bunch more interesting questions for Professor Card. So again, thanks everybody for a great talk, and thanks to our speaker.